So welcome everyone to the first installment of California Wine Institute's Inside California Winemaking. Thank you all for taking the time out to be with us today. In this webinar series, produced specifically for our key Asian markets, wine writer and educator Elaine Chacon Brown will speak with top California producers, bringing a bit of the vineyards and the cellars of the Golden State to our international audience. We've scheduled these webinars to best suit your time zones in the hopes that this hour in the day suits your schedules. And the guest vintners featured in this series also have been selected with you, our audience, in mind to bring you insights about wineries and wines that are present in your markets. Today, we have the privilege to welcome Nate Weiss of Silver Oak and Toomey. Before we get started, some housekeeping reminders for everyone. First, please ensure you have your Zoom screen set to speaker view. There should be an option to select it in the top right corner of your screen. During the webinar, note that there are two communication methods available to participants that we encourage you to use: a chat section as well as a Q&A section. And these are different. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other participants. Just be sure to select everyone in the to field, as it can default to panelists only. And then there's the Q&A section. And this is where we'd like you to submit your questions for Elaine and our guests to answer toward the end of the webinar. We will do our best to address your questions, but please know that if they're not answered live, then they will be provided in the Q&A summary in the email you will receive following the program. So in this email, we will also provide a list of export markets for the wineries represented. So now I'd like to introduce our host, Elaine. In addition to writing for her own site, Waka Waka Wine Reviews, she serves as the American specialist for JancysRobinson.com and is contributing writer to Wine and Spirits magazine and contributes to a long list of respected publications. She contributed to the 8th edition of the World Atlas of Wine, which has won multiple awards very recently, as well as the award-winning 4th edition of the Oxford Companion to Wine. And Nate Weiss. Nate started his winemaking career working harvests in New Zealand, moving back to California, where he's worked with some of California's most respected wineries, including Silver Oak as of 2014. Now, as Vice President of Wine Growing at Silver Oak and Toomey, he continues to craft exceptional Silver Oak Cabernet Sauvignon and oversees Toomey's production of food-friendly, site-driven Pinot Noir, Sauvignon Blanc, and Merlot. Now, Elaine, I'll turn it over to you.
Katie, thank you so much. Nate, I'm so excited that you're here. This series is very special to me. I am so grateful for the opportunity to create a series of webinars, especially for markets across Asia. I have gotten to do some traveling for wine through parts of Asia, and it has been such an honor to meet people there and hear their great love for wine. And so, Nate, I'm so grateful to you for helping us to kick off this inaugural episode for this new series that we're doing.
Really happy to be here, Elaine. And I have to echo that the folks across Asia have been so good to us. It's the least we can do to give back and provide some education.
I'm really grateful to Silver Oak and Toomey for being willing to take this time and start the series in this way. You have been in incredible demand. I seem to see you doing a webinar for different people almost every day. And so having you take time to do this one is really quite special.
It's nothing at all. As I told you, this one would have taken priority over a lot of other things that I do. But
thank you.
Travel is suspended, and so webinars are how we sell wine these days.
It's such a great opportunity, though, to connect with more people and also have the recording available later.
Absolutely.
One of the things I wanted to start with, though, congratulations. The team has just won a major award. The Living Building Challenge is one of the hardest sustainability recognitions to receive in the entire world. It's complicated because there isn't an obvious set of rules. There are guidelines to meet, and then you have to creatively solve those and prove for over a year of use that it's worked. But one of the really significant things to point out is that Silver Oak's building is actually the first production facility, not only the first winery, but the first production facility to ever be recognized by the Living Building Challenge. I was hoping you could tell us more about what that means.
Yeah, it's the Alexander Valley facility is only the 25th building overall in general that has been certified as a living building. And it's because it's a relatively new framework, and it's quite difficult as part of it. So we're very proud of that. It's also the largest project overall by far in square footage, and as you mentioned, the only really, I hate to call it a manufacturing facility, but more or less that's what a winery is, sort of an agricultural manufacturing facility. And so the Living Building Challenge, as you said, it's quite complicated, difficult to explain in any sort of quick way, but they give you a lot of frameworks within and challenges within to work. And the really fascinating thing for us was watching the engineers and the consultants and all the people involved in the design and build out of this winery kind of go through these things that were not your run of the norm in terms of construction. For example, one of the challenges is net zero energy, meaning that they require you to produce more energy than you consume. I think the target is 105%, and we hit 108 with solar panels. They also have a net zero water challenge, which was really kind of interesting because it's very hard to meet in a winery, especially a winery of that size, because making wine requires a lot of water. So it really required a lot of engineering and thought about the whole site and how water infiltrates back into the aquifer, and using recycled wastewater, processed wastewater in a lot of different ways allowed us to basically meet that net zero water guideline. And then probably the most challenging, and probably one that just about anybody can understand, is there's a materials pedal to the LBC. In which they have a red list, kind of like what Google used in their build out down in the South Bay. But there's a whole list of materials that are just not allowed to be used in any way, shape, or form on the site. And so our project manager, Haley Duncan, vetted over 3,000 materials, everything from plumber's tape to the piping that goes in the refrigeration system, and just about everything in between.
Well, and my understanding is those materials are allowed or not based on their potential impact after the use on the site, essentially, like how they would affect the area after the fact, so to speak. That was part of it, and actually one of the more interesting parts of it for us was that the LBC, and this is one of the fascinating parts of sustainability in general, is the LBC also considered how the materials were produced. And so, for example, PVC was not meant to be used. Which had us all scratching our head. PVC is somewhat ubiquitous, especially in a winery setting like this. Right. And it was really because of the way PVC is produced and the health and welfare of the people working in the manufacturing facilities that make the product, not so much the people working in the winery. Well, and isn't the kind of livability of the space, even though it's a workspace, sort of the comfort that is afforded to the people using it is an important part as well, isn't it?
Yeah, there are 7 different pedals, and I've mentioned, I think, 3 of them, but some of the others are things like health and happiness. So the health and happiness of the people who occupy the space, be it a winery where they work, or be it an apartment building or an office building, as well as beauty. So beauty, beauty is kind of hard to define. It's sort of in the eye of the beholder, but we had to make a case for the beauty. In a vineyard setting, it's not so hard to make because people can just get out on their lunch break or after work and walk around the site and be sort of enamored with the natural beauty there. So that was a relatively easy case to make for us, but it's part of the whole evaluation process.
Well, and my understanding is that as a team, you committed to pursuing the Living Building Challenge in 2012, started working on the design aspects, and didn't actually get far enough along in those until 2015 to start building. And then still not until 2018 were you then able to start using the space and start the measurement. So, because you have to prove it all works for more than a year. And then finally, now in 2020, you actually proved it worked, everything's functioning, and you've been awarded the Living Building Challenge.
Yeah, it's a bit of a long-term commitment.
One of the reasons I wanted to make sure and emphasize that, though, is because I think it reflects a kind of cultural perspective that Silver Oak has that is really unique. Silver Oak, the more time I spend understanding how Silver Oak functions, the more clearly what I see is that for Silver Oak, it's not just about the quality of the wine in the bottle, but rather seeing that the quality of the wine in the bottle comes from a really holistic, big picture, long-term vision. And could you comment on that a little more?
I can absolutely. I mean, I could talk for an hour about that. Actually, it's what drew me to Silver Oak and Toomey, and what keeps me here, and what keeps me engaged every day. And you know, I have to admit, it all starts at the top. It's the Duncan family and the ethos that they put into place. We feel like a family. We operate like a family. We refer to ourselves as the whole bunch. Believe it or not, it's sort of a kitschy phrase, but it kind of really summarizes how we feel about one another, in the sense that we're all working together, we're all moving towards the same goals, and you know, from the people doing the landscaping, the vineyard workers, to the cellar workers, to the tasting room, all the way up to the executive level, everybody's pushing in the same direction, and believes very strongly in what we're doing.
Yeah, it's really important. And one of the things that's unique about Silver Oak and Toomey as well, that I think further reflects this same kind of full commitment, holistic view, is that Silver Oak, I believe, is the only winery in North America that owns its own cooperage. Is that right?
It's probably the only North American winery focused on American oak that owns its own cooperage. I know there are a few other wineries that have cooperages that are focused on other types of oak. And it's very much along the same lines, actually, when the cooperage that we own in Missouri has been the primary cooper for Silver Oak for close to 50 years now. We're going into our 49th vintage this year. The family acquired a 0.5% or a half share in the cooperage in 2001. And then in 2015, they bought their partner out. So we now have complete control. And in talking to the Duncan family about that and what it meant and where we could go with that, I told them it's probably going to be a decade before we have really actionable results and really feel like we understand what we're doing and how it's affecting the wines that we're making, because, you know, we have to season the wood, we have to make the wine. Yeah. I don't really care what it tastes like along the way. I want to taste it when it's ready to be bottled, and then when it's ready to be released, because that's what really matters. And then we're going to have to replicate it because we're scientists. And so that whole process is 5 years at a go. And David and Tim kind of nodded at me and said, "Yeah, okay, we can hang with that." That's
great. Now, again, an example of that long-term commitment. So somebody is asking if we can just briefly address it. You know, obviously the pandemic has had an impact on wines and wineries everywhere, but I know that the team atmosphere that you were describing in Silver Oak really shows up in the choices the winery has made in response to that pandemic. So could you just briefly address that? How has it changed things, and what has the winery done in relation to employees and wine growing as well?
Yeah, you know, the safety of the employees is certainly our primary goal. And you know, none of us have ever dealt with this before. We may have thought about a lot of different things that might happen to us here in Northern California, but this wasn't really one of them. And so we've been figuring it out as we go along, but you know, our number one goal was to keep ourselves whole. You know, if we're the whole bunch, we want to be whole. And so we've kept everybody employed. We've found ways to cross-train them in other activities, ways to keep people engaged in doing stuff that's going to help the business and moving forward. So, you know, my part of the business, we slowed down for a couple days, and then you know, there's only so much we can stop doing when you're farming and when you're making wine. And so we're essentially doing what we need to do back in the wineries and vineyards, but the rest of the company is sort of waiting they're itching and with bated breath to get back to work, I bet.
Well, the thing is that for people to remember too, this is actually in vineyards, this is one of the busiest times of year. Obviously harvest is extremely busy, but there's really swift canopy growth happening right now, and that demands a lot of farming maintenance to keep in good shape. And so it's extremely busy for you right now, but vineyards are also a place it's easy to keep distance. And so, so in that sense, not much has changed for most wineries. People just have to keep their vineyards going.
Yeah, you know, in many ways, this time of year is actually harder than harvest, because harvest we can sort of schedule and we can anticipate, and here it's all about the weather and the soil moisture. And actually, my vineyard manager in Napa once said it the best I've ever heard. He said, "The spring is the time of year that I go from a week ahead to 3 weeks behind in about 4 days."
Just crazy. Well, so speaking of vineyards, let's go ahead and look at a map. We're going to start with a map that shows both Alexander Valley and Napa Valley and kind of key points. And then as we turn to talking about the wines, we'll focus in even further on the vineyards that you're working with. But just talk us through these three key points and the role that they play for Silver Oak and Toomey.
Yeah, I think the interesting part of this map is to sort of situate you as to Napa Valley and Alexander Valley and the way they relate to one another. And the key point is the western edge of Napa Valley is defined by the Mayacamas mountain range, which you can see in this this map more or less defines the eastern boundary of Alexander Valley. So from one to the other, you get a little bit closer to the coast, and there's a little bit more marine influence in Alexander Valley. Soda Canyon Ranch is quite a special place to us. So this is a vineyard that the family bought in 1999. Excuse me. It's about 110 acres, which makes it our largest estate vineyard. We farm about 650 acres total between Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino, and Yamhill counties up in Oregon. And this is our largest estate vineyard. So it's all Bordeaux varieties. Its main purpose is to supply Silver Oak Napa Valley Cabernet and blending varieties, but it's also the only source of Toomey Merlot. And the purchase of this vineyard actually was the impetus behind the starting of Toomey in 1999. Jump Rock is a 20-acre vineyard that the family owns in Atlas Peak, which is a mountainous region on the Vaca Range at about 1,500 feet. Very, very arid, kind of sparse vegetation, challenging place to grow grapes, but challenge is rewarded when it comes to grape growing, for sure. And then we're only showing you Crazy Creek Vineyard here, but this is kind of a new acquisition for the family and that they bought in 2016. This is in the Geysers area of Alexander Valley, kind of in between Healdsburg and Geyserville, which we think has a really, really bright future as far as producing top quality Cabernet for us. Well,
and so, as Katie mentioned in introducing you, you actually had experience doing harvest work in New Zealand, and then eventually came back to California and did a lot of work with producers here. And I know, as you and I have spoken previously, you've talked about how those early mentoring experiences really helped inform the perspective you bring to Silver Oak and Toomey now. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Well, for one thing, I grew up around the wine business, and it was always front and center for me because my dad was a winemaker, up until just a couple weeks ago was a winemaker.
He just retired, right?
Literally just retired.
And how many years did he have? 40 some, didn't
he? His first vintage was 1973, I believe. So I think it's 48 total.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Count this year. So I grew up around the wine business. It's very comfortable for me. Some of my earliest memories are playing in wineries and vineyards. But when I actually started down this career path, I was just as green as anybody else. It may have felt more familiar to me, but I still didn't know which end of a pump was which. And so early in my career, after my very first harvest, working for my father at Groth, I went to New Zealand, and a number of us are still in the business and still around and still in touch that worked at Craigie Range back in 2003. Which was a really special experience. And there was a man there named Doug Weiser.
They're in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand, right?
In Hawke's Bay, New Zealand, yeah. In the Gimblett Gravels region specifically. And we worked for a guy named Doug Weiser, who was not only somebody that was sort of a mentor. And when I say a mentor, it wasn't as though he was teaching me the finer points of winemaking, because as I was green as all get out at that point. I was just trying to figure out how not to hurt myself.
Right. Right.
But he taught me kind of the discipline around approaching his work, I think. And I really learned that by watching him more than by him talking to me about it. And he understood everything about a winery and how it operates and how to solve problems creatively and really just the tenacity to never give up. And he was somebody that we all looked up to because he was also very young. He was, at that point, I think he was probably 31 or so, maybe even younger than that. And he was the head winemaker for this fantastic new winery in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand that was doing great things. And unfortunately, he passed away way too young in 2000, and I believe it was 2005.
But it was really one of New Zealand's first prestige wineries, and he was really the founding winemaker, you know. So for you to have the chance to learn from someone like that, who again was leading a winery of that caliber at such a young age. It's pretty remarkable. And there was a whole pack of California winemakers there, Matt Dees and Tegan Passalacqua, if I remember right.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jade Barrett as well, and Laura Harris was there with us of Cliff family at the time, and so we actually all still see each other around and keep in touch for as much as we possibly can. But it's I like to think that Doug still looks down and is proud of all of us.
Right. Well, and then coming back to your work in the States, though, I mean, the role that you have with Silver Oak and Toomey is really unique because you're overseeing wine growing. There's a strong implication in the kind of values and beliefs that are implied by that. Your title is Vice President of Wine Growing. So could you talk to us a little bit about what that means, the role that you take with vineyards and the role you take with the cellar?
Yeah, I think you have to call a spade, and for one person to oversee 650 acres of farming and 4 different winemaking facilities and on and 2 different brands. Obviously, my role is to really put good people in place, empower them, challenge them, give them feedback, help them down the road they need to go. Because I think for me to take any credit at all is probably it's a little bit foolish. But we believe very strongly that our end product is wine, not grapes, and so grape growing and winemaking are not 2 different skill sets and 2 different departments or silos. They flow together. They very much feed off of one another, which I think it's a philosophy as much as anything. So the team has to collaborate, whether you're responsible for farming a vineyard or whether you're responsible for running a winery. We're all kind of working towards the same goal. And quite honestly, I think it's the best job in the world, specifically this job here with this company, for sure.
Well, but I think that what you're describing reconnects back to that point about the holistic vision, that the end result, the quality of wine in the bottle, is dependent on that full vision rather than it being merely the singular goal. What I'm hearing you saying is the quality of grapes is important because you're growing wine, you're not just growing grapes.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
And it's the quality is it's a difficult thing to define, right? I think for us, our goal is never to be the best. Our goal is to be better. And so there's a lot of feedback back and forth between the people that work in the wineries and make the wine and the people that grow the grapes about where things are working and where they're not, what sort of experiments we want to do. There has to be a lot of collaboration, a lot of trust. And, I was actually thinking about, it doesn't start during harvests, but I was thinking back to where it might start, and it actually kind of never ends, honestly.
Right.
Because as soon as the grapes are off the vine, we're thinking about soil health for the next year, and then pruning comes along. And so it's just this continuous cycle that never really stops or starts. It just keeps going.
Well, and we're getting a question about weather this year. We've had quite a hot week right now. It's not shockingly hot, but it is certainly warm. Is there anything you can comment about how this season's going? Does it seem early or normal, or how does it seem to you, and how are the vines doing?
It seems normal in that it's really weird. Best I can say, yeah. It's been a lot of stop-starts. It was not a fairly dry winter. It was a very dry winter. We had zero recordable rainfall in February, which was highly, highly unusual. And we had some early warm weather. We had some slowdowns and some cooler weather, rain, and now it's 100 degrees. And I'm trying to wrap my head around 2020 already, and it's a little hard to do, but I don't think that that's unusual. I think that is somewhat normal. We always feel like this in the late spring, early summer, that we're trying to keep up, we're doing the best that we can, and which way are we headed and so on. But, I think as far as data, it has been a relatively cool season so far.
Right.
Cool and dry.
Right. Well, and so we're also being asked, when is the best time of year for someone to visit? If they're wanting to, people are excited about Silver Oak and Toomey. If they're wanting to come and see the winery and see how the vineyards are doing, when do you think is the best time of year to do that?
Yeah, I think the best time for viewing operations, of course, is harvest. You can see grapevines at kind of the end of the season, and you can see harvest going on in the fields, and you can see the wineries operating and making wine, and you can smell everything that's going on, and get caught behind grape trucks going back and forth from place to place, and shake your fist at them. But it is quite busy during the harvest season, and you may also, especially if you're going to a winery where you might get to interact with the owner or the winemaker, the chances of that are pretty small during harvest time. I kind of like, the February, March, right around bud break.
Yeah.
You can kind of get a sense of the new growth coming out, and the hope springing eternal, and it's a little bit quieter. Typically the weather's quite good. There's a chance of rain, but it's never torrential.
I really like that time of year too, February, March, because for me it feels like this quiet excitement. Like you can tell it's coming, it's on the way. Oh my God, we're starting a new year, and so things are building, but they're still calm. It hasn't taken off yet, so it's like building excitement, but staying in place. And but let's go ahead and start talking about wines, and that'll help us talk about vineyards and growing areas a little bit more too. So Katie, if we could go ahead and see the map for the Alexander Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. It's the first wine that we're going to talk about. And what's interesting here is now of course, you talked about Craig Creek, and that's a new acquisition, but this map really nicely shows other vineyards that play a role in this particular wine, the Alexander Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. And we're looking today at the 2015. Could you talk to us about the role these vineyards play and how that spread across Alexander Valley kind of helps bring a different characteristics to the wine?
Absolutely. So one thing you will notice right away looking at this map is we work, these are estate vineyards. So these are vineyards that the family owns and farms. We do work with a number of growers all over Alexander Valley as well. But the vineyards that we own are largely in the southern half of Alexander Valley. And that's kind of an interesting point as it relates to the Pacific Ocean and the marine layer for Alexander Valley. Because the Petaluma Gap is really the fog gap that acts, there's sort of an open gap to the Pacific Ocean. That's where the fog moves into Sonoma County, and it sort of moves northward through Sonoma County, and the further north you get, the less fog influence there is. So this is really kind of the cooler end of Alexander Valley. So Alexander Valley Estate is where the new winery is. That's where that's located. Miraval is literally right next door. They're about a half a mile, 3/4 of a mile from one another along Highway 128. Crazy Creek is the vineyard near Geyserville, and so Miraval and Alexander Valley Estate together are really just the backbone of our Alexander Valley wines. Red Tail is sort of an interesting story. This is the Chalk Hill corridor of Alexander Valley. There's some great stories about how this part of Sonoma County ended up being a part of Alexander Valley, and some of it, I'm told, had to do with Justin Meyer, who was the first silver winemaker, and his forced will trying to get the lines drawn around the Red Tail vineyard because he wanted it included. If it wasn't Alexander Valley, it wasn't much use. But this is it's definitely the latest vineyard of the Alexander Valley for us. So it means it's sort of the coolest. It's also the most extreme in temperature. It's where when we have heat spikes, they're the worst at Red Tail. When we have frost, there's definitely frost at Red Tail. And it goes up and down. It's a fairly extreme environment. And what I find is that this is sort of the spice and the color and the structure to the Alexander Valley wine. Big River's quite an exciting new acquisition for us as of 2017. It's largely been replanted, so we're getting a little bit of fruit off it now, but very excited for the future. And this is kind of in the Fitch Mountain area. So this is actually Alexander Valley, Russian River Valley, believe it or not. It's included in that appellation as well. And it's a stone's throw from being in Dry Creek Valley as well.
Well, in tasting this wine, I love the texture. There's this, it's such an interesting complex of flavors, this real constellation of flavors, because it's definitely got that spice element that you're talking about, but there's this kind of iron note even there. And then this really just like fine chord of tannin that has such a wonderful mouthfeel effect, and the finish is outrageously long. You know, the Cabernet is often thought of as a really hardy, robust variety, and this is such an elegant expression and such a mouth-watering expression. It's really, but still with that like deeper tone flavor, you know. And one of the things I was thinking about all day today is that, you know, California is famous for Cabernet, but when I think about Silver Oak, I honestly can't come up with another wine to put beside it. It really, you know, and so for a winery to essentially create its own category within such a famous category of wine, California Cabernet, it's one of the most famous wine types in the world. And yet when you think about all the different categories, I mean, different examples of California Cabernet, Silver Oak really stands on its own as its own unique expression of that kind of wine. Do you have thoughts about what is that? Why, you know, what makes Silver Oak so unique in that sense?
You know, it's fascinating. So certainly the American oak is part of it. There aren't a lot of wineries that use solely American oak these days. In 1972, there were a lot more. It was actually fairly common. But now in 2020, it's much less common. It's in California, it's essentially us and Ridge, I believe, as far as I know. Mm-hmm. So that is certainly part of the flavor and aromatic profile of Silver Oak. But you know, it's also something intuitive and something that we chase and that we know. And David Duncan likes to say that Silver Oak is an adjective; it's not a noun. And I believe that to be very, very true. And one of the beauties of the way that I started working for this company is I got to work with the previous winemaker for 3 years, Daniel Barron, who had been here. He worked here for 23 vintages and retired at the end of 2016. And he had worked with Justin Meyer before him for 7 years. And so there's this tremendous goal to find consistency and stabilize the style and make sure we understand what we're looking for. And I think that's actually a big part of it is, you know, there's a famous quote from the Supreme Court about, you know, I know it when I see it. And we definitely know Silver Oak when we see it. When we go through the blending process, we are often, you know, sort of compelled by different wines that we come up with along the way, but they just don't taste like Silver Oak.
Right, right. Yeah, because when you're working with multiple sites as you are, you know, there's so many blends you could create, but as you were describing, there's the two vineyards that consistently form the backbone, and then this one forms the spice. This may be a fruit accent and that's some brightness, you know, but so kind of to dance together to create that blend. It's a pretty fascinating process. Let's go ahead and
we're fascinated to see what some of the other new vineyards bring as well, like Big River.
Let's go ahead and look at the map for Napa Valley. The next two wines we'll look at are, of course, the Napa Valley Cabernet. We're looking at the 2014 vintage for that. Yeah. And then we'll also talk about Toomey 2014 Merlot in a minute. But let's go ahead and start with, just talk us through this map.
So this is, these are vineyards that we farm. I should point out, Navoni is not a vineyard that the family owns. It's owned by a family that's been in St. Helena grapes for a very long time, but they've been selling grapes to us since the 80s, and we actually have an estate farming contract with them, so our vineyard manager farms that vineyard for them. And so it feels like home to us, but I should definitely point out it's not actually an estate vineyard. But, you know, Soda Canyon Ranch, you can see the location in kind of southeastern Napa Valley. And it's sort of in no man's land, which is kind of interesting. You can see it's just below Atlas Peak, but it's too low to be Atlas Peak. It's too far north to be Coombsville, too far south to be Stag's Leap, and too far east to be Oak Knoll. So it's in sort of this beautiful little no man's land, but it's in the foothills of the Vaca Range. It has rolling topography, and we really think of it more as like 6 vineyards in one, and use the different pieces for different parts of the blend. Atlas Peak is, you know, it's muscle wine, it's power, it's a mountain Cabernet. Navoni really gives us a lot of flesh. This is sort of, it is on the valley floor, but it's in sort of a really gravelly loam that it's alluvial. It didn't really come from the river. It came down from the a wash from the hills. And so it's kind of an interesting mix of something that's flat, but really has depth, and it has flavor, and it has flesh to it. And in Calistoga, we grow a touch of Merlot, and that's why this is here. Although the Calistoga vineyard for Toomey is actually mostly Sauvignon Blanc, but we have about an acre and a half of Merlot planted there.
Well, and Katie, could you go ahead and show us the wine slide for the Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon as well? Now, one of the things I want to point out here is that in the Alexander Valley, it's almost entirely Cabernet Sauvignon. And here in the Napa Valley, it's a Cabernet Sauvignon based blend. So can you talk to us about, this reflects the kind of evolution or history for Silver Oak, but can you talk to us about, why is one almost all Cabernet and why is one such a blend?
Yeah, we have a saying here that gets often repeated. We have yet to make our best bottle of wine. So we're focused on continuous improvement. When Daniel Barron started working here in 1994, Daniel's background was working for the Moyex family. So he actually had gone to Bordeaux and interned at Chateau Petrus for the Moyex family in the early, actually in the 82 vintage, he was there at Petrus. From there, he had come back to California, back to the Napa Valley to help start Dominus for the Moyex family. Mm-hmm. And, decided he wanted to get back into winemaking. He had been the general manager at Dominus and started working for Silver Oak when Justin Meyer was looking for his replacement. But he really wanted to make a mark. He wanted to have a little something of his own. And to that point, all Silver Oak wines had been 100% Cabernet Sauvignon for the existence of the winery. And so he convinced Justin to let him make the Napa Valley of Bordeaux blends. Obviously 75% or more Cabernet, because that's the labeling requirements here. And so he started to blend Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, Malbec into the Napa Valley. But the Alexander Valley remained 100% Cabernet until 2011. And 2011, as you know, was just a cooler, more challenging vintage in which Merlot performed really, really well, and not all Cabernet did. And so we sort of looked at what we had to work with, and we said, 100% Cabernet for a long time, but not anymore. And since we've been blending in a little bit, I've even really shaken things up. We've planted some other varieties in the Alexander Valley. But
that's interesting.
Yeah. I'm quite a big fan of Petit Verdot and a lot of the things it can bring to a Bordeaux blend. So we've got a little bit of Petit Verdot going in the ground and some Cabernet Franc even.
That's great. So I've told you this before, but probably 20 years ago, I think, my whole family was together. I'm from Alaska, as you know, and my whole family was back in Alaska to spend Christmas together at my parents' house. And my dad was so excited, he wanted to do something really special. And so he got several different top Napa Valley Cabernets together. One of them was the Silver Oak Napa Valley. And then there were several other wines that were far more expensive, actually. And he, at the end of the meal, we had tasted all the wines, we'd had all the food, we'd had a wonderful day together. And at the end of the meal, he said, that Silver Oak's pretty good. I don't need the other ones. And that was it. He became a Silver Oak fan. It convinced him. And the funny thing about that is my parents both like wine, but my dad actually loves Pinot Noir. My mom loves Cabernet. They both agree on Merlot, but they don't usually like the other varieties. My mom doesn't like Pinot. My dad doesn't like Cabernet, but the exception is Silver Oak. He's a big fan of that.
That's fantastic to hear. Is that where your interest in wine started?
So my dad, I didn't grow up with wine. There just wasn't good wine going into Alaska at the time. And then when I left for college, I came home one summer at the age of 19, and he said, it was this very serious family meeting. He had to we all had to get together, and he had to give us a talk. And the talk was that he would be drinking a glass of wine every day from now on. It was an important announcement. And so that sort of opened the way to wine, and my interest kind of grew from there. But But yeah, and that meal was certainly one of the important moments of kind of showing me other things that were happening. But let's go ahead and look at the Merlot. And this is really historically, this is an important wine for Silver Oak. And as you alluded to earlier, it actually started the Toomey brand. So talk to us about how that happened, and why a different winery label name.
Yeah, so Silver Oak, our focus is Cabernet Sauvignon, American Oak, extended aging, and so the Duncan family, really Silver Oak at that time was a partnership between the Duncan family and the Meyer family, bought Soda Canyon Ranch, which we showed you on the map. It's our largest estate vineyard still to this day. And, its main goal was to supply Silver Oak with Napa Valley Cabernet and blending varieties, but there was a significant amount of Merlot planted there and of some very high quality plant material and very high quality production. And so again, Daniel Barron had spent part of his career over in Pomerol, which are Merlot based wines, and really basically talked Ray Duncan into letting him make a varietal Merlot, which of course, you have to remember, the winery's been in existence for almost 30 years.
Yeah.
We've made 2 Cabernets forever and ever. For a really short period of time, we made 3 with the Bonnie's Vineyard, and that was, one too many after 1991. And so this was a very big step. This was a huge moment in our history. And the only thing that they knew is it couldn't be Silver Oak. We can't make Silver Oak Merlot, so it's got to be something else. And that's how it was founded. So we started out making Merlot in 1999, started making Pinot Noir in 2002 in Russian River Valley. That's when we signed our first lease on 8 acres there. And then started making Sauvignon Blanc in practice runs in 2003, and released the first wine to the public in 2007.
Well, and there's a really important collaboration element with the Toomey Merlot too. Can you tell us about that?
So this is, in addition to getting to work with the cooperage directly and looking behind the curtain there, this is one of the cooler parts of my job, and one of those parts of my career I'm always going to remember. But the technical director for the Moyex family was a man named Jean-Claude Berrouet for almost 50 years, and he retired in 2011. And he and Daniel Barron had remained close and in contact. And when he retired, Daniel said, well, what are you going to do now? He said, well, I'm going to do the consulting thing. I've got clients in China. He actually has clients in Israel, a few other places around the world. And Daniel said, well, are you interested in coming back to California and consulting here? And Jean-Claude Berrouet said, absolutely. I love California. I still have friends there, people I knew from the Dominus days. And so 2012 was the start of this collaboration with him. And he's just a fascinating man. I love working with him. He's a great person to bring into the fold because his focus is Toomey Merlot, but there's a ripple effect across all the different winemakers and wine facilities and brands and wines. I mean, it's a philosophical discussion with him always about winemaking. It's not necessarily about the nuts and bolts of we do this, we do that. He really views his role as asking questions and leading us to the right answer, not telling us what to do, but leading us in the right direction.
It's so interesting having the 3 wines side by side. The Merlot, it's has beautiful strength, I think is the way I would put it. Because there's something, it's such a wine of finesse. And there's even this kind of floral element that emerges from the mid palate. But it's very much a wine of harmony too. There's this multi-note layering of flavor that happens. And there, again, such an incredibly long finish. And then seeing the 2 Cabernets side by side, again, as I said, I thought the Alexander Valley wine was such a wine of elegance. The Napa Valley is a similar size and shape in the mouth, but it feels like it's more about muscle and tenacity, even so. It's not bigger, but it has some sinew. It's a long distance runner, yeah. It wants to work out. It needs activity. There's just this kind of body grip to it. Can you speak to
It's just
that?
the nature of Napa Valley versus Alexander Valley, right? It's one mountain ranging from the coast and a slightly different growing environment. And you know, the access and use of these different varieties also helps us with a lot of those areas. You know, it's very, very polished and round, and it carries a little bit more weight typically than the Alexander Valley, which is a little more knees and elbows in places, which is part of the allure of it, with the acidity and the structure. And you know, I think your description of the Merlot is on point. So some really interesting things that have come about working with Jean-Claude is that the Merlot is less and less Merlot every year, and it tastes more and more like Merlot, right? It's he's been adding or driving us to add more Cabernet Franc, more Petit Verdot. In this particular vintage, 2014, actually, there's some Cabernet Sauvignon, which was sort of something we had not done before and have not done since, but that vintage, for whatever reason, it worked. And Jean-Claude is all about texture. Everything is about texture with him. And so that's really what drives his blending. And it's kind of a funny process with him because, you know, he's been doing it so long and has, in addition to just the Petrus and the Magdalene, he also blended, you know, many other wines, Negociant wines for the Moyex portfolio. So he was blending maybe hundreds of wines a year. And so he'll come out and we'll start blending. And, you know, I'm still very much a hammer swinger as a blender. I'm just stubborn. So we building and we try everything and look at how all the pieces fit together. And he's just very intuitive. And so oftentimes he'll just sort of imagine a blend, put it down on paper, we put it together in the glass, and we go, that's a really, really good wine. You know, I'm sure we can do better than this. And we spend 2 or 3 days trying to do better than that, and we can't do it.
He's just got it.
He's just got it. Yeah, some people got it.
Tell us just briefly, we have a couple of questions coming in, but just briefly, tell us about the ageability that you see on these 3 reds across vintages.
Yeah, you know, Silver Oak, for me, you know, of course, it's always about how you like your wines. For me, they really hit their stride at 20 years. That's like the sweet spot for me. I happened to be hanging out with David Duncan on my 40th birthday, which was a couple years ago. And we opened in 1978 Alexander Valley. I wasn't really sure what to expect, and it held up really, really well. I was super impressed. So they can go that long, you know. But for me, I love the kind of where the secondary starts to take off, but you're not quite into tertiary mode as far as aromatics go. You still have a little bit of fruit. You still have a little bit of weight across the palate before it starts to thin out a little bit. So for me, 20 years is really the sweet spot. Kind of mid-90s to early 2000s right now is a great place.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that's such an important part of any ageability conversation is, you know, there's kind of 2 questions to answer. One, can it hold up? You know, is it intact? Does it last? But then do you like it? You know, yeah. So a lot of wines, they can age, but do you want them to age that long is the other thing that has to be answered. And I know in terms of how long Silver Oak can last, my experience has been that it can last an incredibly long time. Yeah. And so you just decide what style of expression do you want from the age. Yeah,
you know, I think holding on is of course, you know, important, but not the goal. We want to see improvement.
Yeah.
Again, you know, I think it's about personal preference as to what that improvement target is. You know, whether or not something is still on the upslope as far as quality is in the eye of the beholder.
So you mentioned earlier that you grow Sauvignon Blanc in the Calistoga Ranch. Is that right?
That's correct.
So someone is asking if you could talk to us about why in Calistoga. What is it about that vineyard versus some of your other ones that suits Sauvignon Blanc so well?
You know, that's an interesting story, and this is where, you know, any illusion you had that we're the smartest people in the room is going to go out the window. But the family bought this winery in Calistoga on Dunaweel Lane because they wanted a place to make Tumi Merlot, literally a winery facility, and it had 12 acres planted there, and that 12 acres happened to be mostly Sauvignon Blanc. At the time, we were only making Merlot and the Silver Oak Cabernets. And the discussion was very much around, you know, do we sell the grapes? Do we replant the vineyard? You know, do we do this? Do we do that? And somebody realized, you know, we when we go do these wine dinners and when we have events and things, we buy other people's white wines or sparkling wines and we pour them. Why don't we just give it a shot. Why don't we just start making Sauvignon Blanc and give it a go? And so, kind of as I alluded to earlier, for 4 years, we just sort of practiced. We wanted to figure out who we wanted to be and what style of wine we wanted to make. And so for 4 years we did that, and finally released our first Sauvignon Blanc to the public in 2007. And so it's not as though we chose Sauvignon Blanc in Calistoga; it kind of chose us.
Mm-hmm. No, it's great. It's so important though to have that white wine to start the dinner, as you mentioned.
Yeah, and internally, many of us are probably our best customers as far as Sauvignon Blanc goes.
Right. Yeah. So one more question, and then we've actually taken almost an entire hour already, if you can believe it. It's gone quite quickly. But one more question here is, James is asking, how is the Silver Oak Bonnie's Vineyard series fit into the overall portfolio?
So that's people that love Silver Oak love Bonnie's Vineyard in the story. I got to admit, I don't know how it started. It may have been that the Meyers bought the property, but Bonnie's Vineyard is right across Con Creek from the Silver Oak Oakville location, literally maybe 3/4 of a mile, and right next to Groff, actually. And it was the Meyer family household, and the vineyard outside, Justin named Bonnie's Vineyard, or perhaps Bonnie named it Bonnie's Vineyard, I don't know. And so I believe it was 1979, we started making a single vineyard wine from that vineyard. And it was super popular because it was very much a singular wine, much like Heights Martha's Vineyard. It was it had sort of a eucalyptus character. There are no eucalyptus trees, but it definitely had that character, sort of a camphor or a mint type of aroma. And so very distinct, and people absolutely loved it. And so it was kind of a small single vineyard bottling for many years. And I think at some point, honestly, Justin just got sick of having to tell people no and hearing people complain that they couldn't get as much Bonnie's as they wanted. And in 1991, after that vintage, he said, forget it. We're just going to blend it in an apple from now on.
Hey.
So it was actually Justin Meyer's decision to stop making Bonnie's, believe it or not.
So it reflects a unique moment in time, just that it was bottled separately for a while.
Yeah, and we have people come into the tasting room constantly that look, they're asking about Bonnie's. They're hopeful we might have a bottle to sell, and sometimes they actually bring it in with them, and we get to taste it.
Oh, that's great. So we're actually out of time. I want to remind everyone that in the follow-up email, the information for the different import markets will be included, and so we can look forward to that email sent to each of you within a week or so. But I want to thank everyone across Asia for joining us. It is really such a special opportunity to be able to offer this session for all of you. I'm so grateful to all of you for joining us and for including me in this conversation, and most especially for including Nate and Silver Oak. Nate, thank you so much for making time. I so appreciate it.
It was really my pleasure. This was great. I really enjoyed this.
Good. Thank you so much. Thank you again to everyone.
And thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Nate, for such really interesting, fascinating conversation. And thank you to all our attendees. We hope that you enjoyed today's inaugural episode, and that you will join us in 2 weeks' time for our second episode on Thursday, June 11th. And that will feature winemaker Michael Eddy of Lewis and Martini Winery, also in the Napa Valley. So thank you all again.
Thank you.